Okay. So this is a study that was done where we were looking at what BCBAs were targeting when they were doing safety skills training. And then the research also looked at what were some of the ways that they were teaching individuals with disabilities how to be safe and how to respond to some of these risks. Um, so let me start with this here. So what this study did is it was interviews. Well, not interviews. They sent out a survey that listed a whole bunch of different potential risks, and they asked BCBAs, "Hey, which of these risks do you think is most dangerous, right? Which are the risks that we need to be looking at?" And it was on a scale of 1 to 5, right? So 1 is that it's not a risk, I'm not worried about it. And 5 was it's a really big risk, I'm really, really worried about it. And so they said on a scale of 1 to 5, which ones of these are most important to address? And as you can see, based off of the choices that were given, BCBAs thought, well, all of these are issues, right? We want to make sure that we're looking at all of these. And they did mention abduction and sexual abuse were really high, right? So BCBAs know that this is an issue, and they know that this is something that they need to be programming for and potentially teaching. So now I want you to look at table 6. So this is where they ask BCBAs, how are you actually teaching these safety skills? And so you'll see we have a list of the different safety skills here. Behavioral skills training is up at the top, DTT, prompt and prompt fading, using reinforcers, video modeling, all the way down, right? I want to focus a little bit on that top one, on behavior skills training. So for those of you that don't know what it is, it's a really structured teaching strategy that's going to walk a client through 4 steps in order to help keep them safe. So the clinician is going to provide instruction about how to help the client identify what the issue is, right? What the dangerous situation is, and then behavior skills training is then going to teach the client to make a response. So one that's really frequent is teaching individuals with disabilities how to respond to lures from a stranger. And so what they would do is they would teach the individual that if a stranger came up to them and had some sort of a lure, right? Like, oh, hey, come look in my car, or hey, come with me. They taught the individual with a disability to know that that was dangerous. Then they taught the individual to do something, to say no, to say stop. And then they taught the individual with a disability to go and report it to someone that they were familiar with. And this type of training, that behavior skills training, it can work really well for specific kinds of safety threats. But if we're teaching a child to recognize abuse that's happening in relationships, it's going to be a little bit more nuanced than that, which is why we kind of need to take a critical look at this. So the majority of BST research on relationship safety, it's like I said, it's been conducted with regards to strangers. So when they're teaching people to identify unsafe situations, oftentimes they're just teaching strangers. They're not teaching, acquaintances or caregivers could also be perpetuating abuse. So the research is really only targeting one specific perpetrator. And like we talked about, that's not the only perpetrator. And then additionally, um, sorry, I lost my train. BST, when you're looking at relationships, we're making the assumption that the person with a disability is able to actually leave that situation, right? So in the instance of a stranger, they may be able to leave the situation, right? They may be able to say no, stop, and then get themselves out of there. However, in situations where they are relying on the person for care, they may not actually be able to leave that situation. And so behavior skills training, like I said, can work in an instance where the client can actually leave that situation safely. But what about instances where they aren't able to leave that situation safely? And so behavioral skills training can definitely be a reliable strategy. It can be a way that we teach some of these other safety skills, but I don't think it's a blanket strategy that we should be using, especially when we're looking at teaching relationship safety skills. Okay. And then this is just kind of a visual that breaks down a little bit more about the interventions that are often used to teach safety skills. The didactic instruction, modeling social behavior, practicing with feedback, reinforcement, these are all things that we are very familiar with as BCBAs. And they can work together as a package for sure, because we know that all of these strategies are going to be important. But what we're going to be talking about as we move forward is how to take the strategies that we already know and make sure that we're expanding that to a variety of situations with a variety of potential perpetrators. And then we might be missing some pieces too. So we're also going to address that in this presentation and then in other ones as well. Okay, Carolyn.
Okay, so building on what Tricia just walked us through, this is where we turn to the literature and ask a different question. Not just what works, but what's missing. First, to be very clear, there is no direct evidence that rule-based ABA strategies are ineffective. And that distinction matters because this is not about dismissing established practice. However, the literature consistently points to limitations, particularly in how relationships are taught. Specifically, skills that are learned in structural environments, as Tricia just mentioned, often do not generalize to the complexity of real-world relationships. And that's where safety actually matters, which brings us to a critical takeaway. Discrimination training is essential. Individuals need to be able to determine when, where, and with whom a skill applies, not just follow a rule, but interpret a situation. So the issue is not whether ABA works, it's whether we are teaching in a way that supports real-world decision-making. And when we look more closely at safety skills research, that distinction becomes even clearer. Next slide, Tricia. So when we narrow in specifically on safety skills research, particularly in areas like abduction prevention and bullying, we see something important. There's strong evidence that our core strategies, behavioral skills training, modeling, rehearsal, they are effective. So again, this is not a question of whether ABA works. The issue is what those strategies are preparing individuals to do, because effective instruction in these studies goes beyond simple rule following. Requires individuals to discriminate, to determine when a rule applies, when it doesn't apply, and how to adjust based on the context. Following a rule like don't talk to strangers is straightforward, but navigating a situation with someone you know, a peer, a caregiver, a family member, that requires judgment. And rule-based approaches alone do not reliably build that level of decision making. They teach what to do, but not necessarily how to decide. And when we look at the broader research, we see that gap show consistently. Next slide, Tricia. So when we step back and we look across the research, a consistent pattern emerges. Individuals can often demonstrate knowledge. They can state the rule. They can identify the correct response. But that does not consistently translate into behavior in the real world. Knowledge is not the same as doing. Most interventions are evaluated in highly structured, controlled environments, as Tricia indicated. Classroom-based programs improve understanding of boundaries, but they don't necessarily prepare individuals for the variability and ambiguity of real relationships. And importantly, we have very limited data on how these skills hold up in natural relationship-based contexts, not because it's not important, but because it's difficult to study ethically. So the absence of evidence here is not reassurance, it's a limitation. There are also areas we haven't meaningfully explored, like interoceptive awareness and internal cues, which are critical. So we put this together, we are teaching skills that work in controlled settings, but we have limited evidence that holds up in the environments where risk actually occurs. And that gap is where the vulnerability lies. Next slide, Tricia. So if we take everything we've just discussed, we know the risk is high. We know that risk is largely relational. And we know there is a gap between what's taught and what's used in real world situations. So here's the issue. if harm is happening within relationships, but we're primarily teaching safety as if it's about strangers, then we are not fully preparing individuals for the situations they are most likely to encounter. In other words, what we're teaching does not fully match how harm actually happens. And when there's a mismatch between instruction and environment, the learner is the one who carries the risk. So the question becomes, if stranger danger isn't enough, what do individuals actually need to know and be able to do to stay safe in real relationships? Next slide, Tricia. So if we move beyond a stranger danger framework, what do we really teach? We shift toward three core areas: boundaries, warning signs, and personal preferences. Boundaries, what is and is not okay in terms of physical and social interaction. Warning signs, recognizing behaviors that may indicate risk even when the person is familiar. Preferences, understanding I like versus I don't like, which becomes the foundation for content and self-advocacy. For consent, I'm sorry. These are not rigid rules. They are context-dependent skills, which means we're no longer just teaching what to do, we're teaching how to evaluate situations. And that shift requires something more complex than rule following. Next slide, Tricia. And that something is judgment. Judgment, or the ability to interpret context, weight cues, and make a decision, requires flexible responding, not just recalling a rule. And for many of the individuals we support, this is an area of difficulty, which means we cannot assume it develops incidentally. Judgment has to be directly taught through multiple examples, varied context, and guided decision-making, not just correct or incorrect responding. Because real-world safety is rarely clear-cut. It lives in the gray area. So that brings us to how we actually teach these skills. Next slide, Tricia. If we want individuals to navigate real relationships, our teaching has to reflect real conditions. Role play, practicing scenarios that mirror real interactions. Peer discussion, exposing individuals to different perspectives and interpretations. And real life context, teaching and practicing skills in the environment where they're actually going to be used. And most importantly, multiple varied examples. Because, as we know, generalization is not automatic. It has to be programmed. So when we look at this as a whole, we're moving from a model that emphasizes rule following to one that builds decision making within relationships. And that shift requires more than just changing in what we teach, but also requires us to look at areas we've historically been avoiding. One of the most critical and often overlooked components of prevention is sexuality education.